Welcome to Unforbidden Truth. I'm Andrew. Today I'll be speaking with Mark Saffric. Mark Saffric is a retired Supervisory Special Agent from the FBI's Elite Behavioral Analysis Unit, better known as the BAU. Mark is widely recognized for his expertise in criminal profiling and behavioral analysis, with over 30 years in law enforcement, including 23 years with the FBI, during which he consulted on numerous high-profile national and international violent crime cases, specializing in serial and mass murders, sexual assaults, and complex crime scenes. After retiring from the FBI, Mark co-founded Forensic Behavioral Services International alongside fellow profiler Robert Ressler, and following Ressler's passing in 2013, continued to lead the firm, offering expert analysis and consultation on intricate criminal and civil cases across the globe. In addition to his operational work, Mark is a respected academic, holding an MS in criminal justice from Boston University and serving as an adjunct faculty member at Boston College, having lectured to more than 20,000 law enforcement professionals worldwide and taught at institutions such as the University of Pennsylvania and the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. His research has made contributions to the understanding of violent crime, particularly in the area of elder sexual homicide, and he has authored numerous scholarly articles and book chapters, including work featured in the Routledge International Handbook of Sexual Homicide Studies. Here's my interview with Mark Saffric.
My name is Mark Saffric. I am retired FBI criminal profiler. I started my law enforcement career in 1977. I was a police officer in California. I worked patrol for about 3.5 years, and I promoted into detectives. Started in property crimes and then went into crimes against persons, sexual assaults, homicides, ADWs, assaults with deadly weapons. And I went to this homicide school in 1982. Excuse me, 1982. And there was a couple FBI profilers that came out to give us 2 days of instruction. And I was absolutely mesmerized by this different way of looking at violent crime from a behavioral perspective, from an integration of forensic evidence, behavioral evidence, and physical evidence. And I had a couple of complex homicide cases that I was working. So long story short, I ended up submitting those through the Sacramento FBI office to the behavioral unit. And that's what started my association with the unit. And after about a year, I decided that's really the direction I wanted to take my career. So I applied to the FBI. It took me about a year to get in. And then it took me about 11 years to get into the unit. So it was a long, long haul. I spent almost 13 years in the behavioral analysis unit before retiring and joining one of the legends in this discipline, Bob Ressler, who's written a number of books and was really one of the first people to, decide that we should be interviewing spree killers, serial killers, mass murderers to understand, them, the dynamics of their crimes and how they make decisions. And sort of the rest is history. I joined him and then I essentially took over the business about a year later when he was getting ill. And now I've had forensic behavioral services for about almost 18 years now.
That's amazing. That's quite the resume.
So, yeah, it's, people ask me, what's the most interesting case you've ever worked? And it's a very hard thing for me to say because typically the types of cases that I work, both when I was in the unit and even now, are very complex homicide cases. And they all have their own sort of interesting dynamics. Some can have multiple offenders, multiple victims, a lot of what I would describe as psychopathology within the crime scene, within the crime and crime scene. And they're all unique. I mean, they're all very different. So it's really hard for me to say, I can't really pick out a single case. I can pick out a number of cases that are interesting for different reasons. Um, but the challenge, I think one thing that people, I think well, most of the general public thinks that the FBI's profilers can profile any homicide. And that's really not true because the vast majority of violent crimes, and not just homicides, but sexual assaults and equivocal deaths, um, the vast majority um, are readily solved by competent homicide investigators. They don't, there's a history. It could be a domestic violence history, could be gang activity history, could be drug activity history. But there's usually, connecting factors that the police readily hone in on. So those kinds of cases really, they don't need the type of assistance or analysis that I can provide. So it's only when you get into sort of if you look at a bell-shaped curve of violent behavior, that extreme end of violent behavior is where is sort of the area that I work in, those complex cases that have a lot of psychopathology within the scene, excessively violent, a lot of time spent at the crime scene, a lot of interaction between the offender and victim, multiple offenders, multiple victims. Um, so those are the kinds of cases that the more psychopathology we have, the better it is for us. So most cases just simply they just don't have that level um, of interest. I mean, they don't have that level of complication. And, for the most part, homicide detectives solve those cases on their own. They don't need us. It's only when you have, very aberrant behavior, very unusual behavior, or some other dynamic that they're not really, you know, used to seeing.
Right, right. So I know you mentioned a little bit about the BAU already, but can you talk about how it all started and what it entailed when it came to your work at the BAU?
So originally, and this is more of an internal thing, and I think some people still refer to it, but originally it was the Behavioral Sciences Unit, which still exists. That was really part of the FBI Academy's training academy, right? What was happening was in the early 1970s, the FBI was hosting national academies. So the FBI hosts about 225 law enforcement officers from around the world 4 times a year for 11-week sessions. They live at the academy. A lot of these agencies were bringing these unsolved, very interesting homicide cases and asking the behavioral sciences unit, like, can you offer an opinion about this case? And what we learned is we really didn't know much about serial killers and spree killers and mass murderers, sexual homicide offenders. And that was really sort of the impetus to start that research, which began really in probably the early to mid 1970s. And an interesting fact, and most people don't really know this, but if you want to study something, you have to identify it. And we actually there was really no term serial killer until 1977 when my former partner Bob Ressler categorized certain types of killers as serial killers, and we actually, um, wrote up a definition for it. But before that, they were called rampage killers, multiple murderers, uh, series killers. Oftentimes, they were called mass murderers. So you can't study something unless you've defined it, and we had never defined it. No one really had, and that was where that whole dynamic started, really about the mid 1970s. And then, we started the unit started doing research and looking at other types of crimes related to violence and teaching law enforcement agents around the world in the National Academy, what we were learning in the research. I joined the unit in 1995. Um, it's when the director of the FBI decided to split off I guess, sort of the operators in the behavioral sciences unit from the academics. So the academics remained in the behavioral sciences unit, and then the actual profilers who were going out into the field and working cases, um, they split off into what is known now as the behavioral analysis unit, and really has been since about that time frame. At the time, we had the adult crimes unit, which is what I was in. So we handled everything from serial murder, spree murders, mass murders, equivocal deaths, serial sexual assaults, um, uh, sexual homicide, and unusual cases. And then the child crimes unit handled generally crimes against children, child exploitation, child sexual exploitation. And after 9/11, the FBI developed or put together a third threat assessment terrorism unit to deal with that. So at the time I retired, there were three units, and then of course we had our VICAP unit, which was the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. That was something that all of us used for a resource. And of course, it was designed for law enforcement agencies to input their cases and to see if there were matches around the country. Um, After I left in 2007, retired, uh, they started a cyber crimes behavioral unit. So now there's that additional cybercrime behavior unit. So we've done a lot of research. We uh, teach law enforcement. We work cases around the world, mostly in the U.S., but I have worked cases all over the world from the unit. I've traveled to South Africa and to Brazil and Ireland and Germany to work cases. It just depends, who's making the request and, if it's something within our wheelhouse that, we think we can assist them with.
Hmm. Are you able to talk about any serial homicide cases that you have worked, whether they were actively killing or you were just there to simply interview them?
Oh, sure. So, yeah, I've worked a number of serial cases when the killings were going on. And typically what happens is that a task force is formed from the various agencies that have cases that they believe are linked to a particular offender, unknown offender. Um, I've worked on the Spokane serial murder case. I testified in the death penalty case that that's not Spokane. At the time, Spokane had, I think, 14 cases or so, but there were two additional cases outside of Pierce County, which was on the coast, right, just south of Seattle. So I worked that case when the offender was unknown at the time. We had a number of cases, I think maybe 16 or 17 cases. Um, so I was out there to go to the crime scenes to first figure out, are all of these cases linked? Right. So that's what we want to first discover. Do we have a linkage? But I've worked those cases. I was on the Derek Todd Lee case with the task force out of Baton Rouge, or Baton Rouge, as they say, um, for a couple of weeks. Derek Todd Lee wasn't known at the time. They had another serial killer that was active at the same time. So I was working on that with my partner. Um, at the same time we were working the Derek Todd Lee case. Um, I worked a number of serial cases over the years. I worked a case out of South Africa with uh, with 40 um, homicide victims. Worked with the South African police service. I worked a serial rapist case out of the UK. I've worked serial rapist cases unknown here. So yeah, I've worked a number of active cases before the killers were known, and then of course I've done a number of interviews with incarcerated offenders, both for television and also as part of research. We had research projects going on. Um, I did and specialized in research that I developed looking at the sexual homicides of elderly women, and I developed an expertise in that, and actually a worldwide expertise. Nobody was really looking at those types of cases. So a number of my cases were serial murder cases. A lot of them were single homicide cases, sexual homicide cases, but that victim group had not really been studied before. So that was, we just adding to the research. A lot of research in sexual homicide, but this was one group of victims that we hadn't really studied in terms of homicides. There had been some research looking at elderly females in terms of sexual assault. Some of them lived, some of them did not. But this research was focused specifically on murder cases, sexual homicide cases. But yeah, I've done, you know, cases where they're active and the offender is unknown, cases where the offender is incarcerated. Typically, in a serial murder case, you're not going to be interviewing somebody that's been arrested but not tried yet. Just because of the dynamics of having a defense and not having gone to trial. But I have interviewed incarcerated offenders on various crimes, serial murder cases, and others.
You mentioned going to South Africa. Was that happen to be for Moses Sithole by chance?
Um, it was, I don't think so. It was a series of all male victims,
Hmm.
um, all African males, young, uh, mostly from 12 to like 15. Um, but I think the offender was not well known. It wasn't that case.
Okay,
Different case.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious because that case has always been interesting to me. Moses Sithole is like a phenomenon in itself in South Africa. Probably one of the most high profile at that, huh?
Well, maybe outside of Oscar Pistorius.
Right, right,
Right. So, although he wasn't a serial killer or anything, but in terms of notoriety, his case was very high profile.
right. So can you talk about criminal profiling when it comes to serial offenders, what the process is of creating a profile for that offender or offenders?
Sure. So, I think when most people think of the FBI's profiling unit, they think of criminal profiling. So, but criminal profiling is one aspect of the types of services that the FBI offered under the umbrella of criminal investigative analysis. So when you talk about criminal profiling, you're talking about linking the offender characteristics within a crime scene to a particular individual. Most of the cases that we would work would be unknown offender cases where you're trying to develop um, essentially a a behavioral profile or a personality profile of an individual, their habits, to help law enforcement narrow the full focus of, say, a potential pool of suspects. So criminal profiling isn't allowed in U.S. courts because we are not allowed to talk about the dynamics of the crime scene and then link them to a particular individual. That really invades the purview of the jury and the judge. But what we do oftentimes is crime scene analysis. Literally everything that we do, whether it's um, advise on search warrant considerations, expert testimony work, um, personality, indirect personality assessment, um, search warrant considerations, what kind of language should go into a search warrant. All of those require us to analyze the dynamics of the crime scene. So I would say that's the most important thing for us to do. And then we can do for a lot of agencies like an unknown offender profile. Like, what does this individual look like? What are his relationships going to look like? What is driving the crime? What is going on here, right? We can do that by assessing injuries, by assessing the whole process of the crime, planning, the the evidence or lack of evidence of planning and organization, injuries, weapon use, MO, other behavioral dynamics like MO, staging behavior, ritualized behavior, undoing behavior, depersonalization. Those are the kinds of dynamics that appear in the cases that we typically work on. And as I said before, when you're working a serial murder case, right, the idea is to figure out, are all of these cases linked? Because you may have an agency that says, I think this case is part of the series. It may or may not be, right? So clearly establishing a linkage. Now, maybe that linkage is done through forensic evidence. Maybe you have hairs, fibers, DNA, right? Fingerprints. But if you don't, and you're relying on the behavioral aspects of the case, then that's where we can assist, right? So, in a serial case, it's important, I think, from our perspective, to understand when the series started, and once you start looking at the cases, um, rendering an opinion of whether the first case that we're looking at, is actually the first case. There may be aspects to the cases where I would say, based on this behavior, this case that we're identifying as the first case is not his first case. There are previous cases. So that's important. Looking at the cases chronologically to understand what the time separation in those is. And that's difficult sometimes because you may have a case that predates another case, but the victim isn't found until after later cases. So trying to figure out where in the series this particular case is based on perhaps decomposition or last seen records. When people say, hey, the last time I saw her was this night, and then supposed to get together with the next day, she didn't show up. So actually getting the order right and then looking for escalation or perhaps de-escalation among the cases. And, is there a learning curve? Because typically with modus operandi, offenders are learning to be better offenders. And they do this oftentimes through trial and error. And so, they do something and an aspect of that may not work out for them. And then they try to compensate for that in the next case that they do. So I'm looking to see, is there progression through the series? Is he getting better or is she getting better through the series? Uh, are they learning, right? So, or is there an escalation of violence, right? Is this fantasy driven? And if so, is the fantasy not fulfilling, what the individual's hoping for? And so we see successfully more violent crimes. And all of that, in a serial case, I follow literally the same protocol in every case. And that is that first I want to understand victimology. Have to understand who the victim is. I remember getting a call on the Gilgo beach killer when they first identified some of these remains, and they asked me, is this a serial killer? And I said I have no idea, because you don't really know anything until you know who your victims are. If you don't have a victim identity, that's your starting point. You've got to identify the victims. If you have no identity, you really, there's no way to comment on anything like that. And that was the problem initially in the Gilgo Beach killings, as I was being asked to render opinions about unidentified remains. Like, well, there's nothing you can really say until we know who these people are. So victimology is one of the keys because I want to understand why this particular person became the victim of this violent crime. Is it something in their criminal history? Is it something in their social history, sexual history, financial history, travel history? What are their relationships like? Is this person married, unmarried, divorced? What's that dynamic look like? What kind of job do they have? How do they get there? What do their financial records look like? Is there a psychiatric history here? So not all of that is applicable to every case, but I want to delve into their background to understand, at what risk are they for becoming the victim of a violent crime? Risk level is important. And on the flip side, victimology helps me to understand what level of risk the offender is willing to take to commit the crime. So you have different dynamics. You can have the same victim. For instance, you can have a sex worker who's working when her risk is very high because she's engaging with people she doesn't know under the cover of darkness. She's going to isolated locations. The risk for the offender at that time is low. The risk for her is high. That informs me the potential size of the offender pool. Now, the converse, you may have the exact opposite. You may have the same sex worker who's not working, who is in a locked environment with her kids and her dog. And someone breaks in and attacks her in the residence. So now her risk level is much, much lower, but the level of risk for the offender to assault her at that time is much higher. So understanding that victim and offender risk dynamic informs motive for me. It informs whether the crime is targeted or opportunistic. It informs the access. It informs what obstacles someone either disregarded or had to overcome to commit the crime. So victimology, there's a lot of components to it, but that's really a key piece. And then I want to understand what are the injuries? What is the cause of death? What is the weapon? How many weapons do we have? Injury is very important. I have published on injury. I developed a homicide injury scale, which has been used by others and is found to be a valid scale. But so injury is very important. And what is the weapon and how many injuries? When were they inflicted? How were they inflicted? Are the injuries post-mortem? Are they ante-mortem? Are they peri-mortem? Are they superficial injuries? Are they defensive injuries? Are they fatal injuries? And I gleaned that information from the medical examiner's report. So I'm leaning on another expert to tell me, and of course, I've read thousands of autopsies, so I have a very good understanding of what I'm reading and can draw my conclusions based on the types of injuries. And not only that, but where the injuries were inflicted, what does the scene look like? How did the offender access the scene? You know, did this appear to be a planned crime, or is there a lot of disorganization? What post-offense behaviors do we have going on? What did the offender do with the victim after the homicide? Are they engaging with the victim? Or are they just leaving the victim at the scene. So there are all these various nuances that I'm looking at within a crime scene. And some of them are very subtle. Others aren't so subtle. Some are applicable. When I use the same template, some things just don't apply based on the case or the victim or the location, and other things are more important because what I'm really trying to understand is what happened here. How did the events unfold, both chronologically and temporally? And ultimately, can we answer the why? Why this question? Why this person? Why this day? Why this time? Why this location? Why this way? Sometimes I can't answer all those, but that's my goal. So in a serial murder case, I'm doing that with each case. And I already know, first I would say, I know that the cases are linked. And then secondly, I know the best I can know the series of the cases. Who was first, second, third. Um, I don't always know that, but so once I have that information, then I can start analyzing the cases. And I look at each one because each case is different. Each victim's different. Scenarios are different. And um, that's really the process. I use that process really for any case, whether it's a sexual assault, serial sexual assault, whether it's a sexual homicide, single case. It's not a serial case. If it's an equivocal death, and I don't know if your listeners know what an equivocal death is, but an equivocal death is where the manner of death is unknown. So in the United States, we have five manners of death. You have homicide, natural, suicide, accident, and then we have a category called undetermined. Sometimes you can't tell what it is. You can eliminate one or two of the manners, but you don't know. Is it suicide or homicide? Is it an accident or is it natural? Is it suicide or accident? So then those are really some of the most difficult cases to do because when you have a homicide, you know what you have. You know you have a homicide. So you work from that premise. But if you don't know what you have, if you don't know the manner of death, you may know the cause of death, but you may not know the manner of death. And then so now you're basically, hypothesizing, here are the things that are consistent with homicide. Here are things that are inconsistent with homicide. Here are things that are consistent with suicide or with accident. So those are almost more difficult types of cases because you have to go through the process, to and in the end, you're just rendering an opinion, right? Based on your analysis. My opinion is that this is more likely than not based on what I've proffered here, this manner versus this.
So, do you have any memorable interviews or any memorable cases that you worked on that you were just excited to close or somebody just excited to interview?
Um, I've had cases that are unsolved that I've worked on that have perplexed me for my career. I worked on the Jennifer Lynn case out of Castro Valley, California, outside San Francisco. I worked on that case with Henry Lee. Henry is a friend of mine. Uh, I was out to that scene three different times. Um, I know what happened. I know how it happened. Pretty sure I know why, but I don't know the who. it's very frustrating. I don't think that case will ever be solved. Um, I had an interesting case out of Washington State, a mother and daughter murdered up in the woods with a lot of really unusual behavior. Uh, as I assessed the case, I was pretty sure I knew the dynamics of everything, but I didn't, couldn't figure out who it was. You know, I think I don't know what the status of that case is, but it was unsolved the last time I saw. Interesting interviews. I would say I interviewed a guy named Reggie McFadden. He's a serial killer. Um, Reggie was a very interesting interview. He's quite articulate, quite engaging and charismatic. Um, really liked to pull the conversation in his direction. Some suspects are very good at that, like moving the direction of where you want to go to where they want to go. I found myself constantly trying to pull him back. Okay, so that's fine, but here's what I asked you, right? But sort of a charming guy, right? You understand when you're talking to him how he could be very affable with um, potential victims. I thought his interview was very interesting. Contrasted with Joel Rifkin, who I interviewed. Um, Joel Rifkin, I was very surprised that for as long as he had been incarcerated, um, and no doubt had been examined by psychiatrists and psychologists throughout his uh, criminal career because of the trials that he went through, um, that I would have expected that he had a better grasp on why he did certain things, but he didn't. I mean, even for somebody in the medical field to explain to him, right, what their diagnosis was and why he thought about certain things certain ways. He seemed to not grasp any of that. I was surprised. I expected someone who would have a better understanding of why they were doing what they were doing. Although he was interesting in the sense that when we started talking about some cases, I could see that he was drifting away, um, like playing it over in his mind, the crime. They're like a film reel that he was reliving the event. I could just see the way he drifted away from me when we talked about certain cases. I think I even commented to him about that, um, that he was reliving the case. He was you know, seeing what had happened again in his mind. He had it all captured. Those are two interesting interviews. I interviewed a serial rapist, Christopher Hubbard. Um, he was an interesting, some people um, are really, in tune with why they're doing certain things, and others aren't. He was pretty clear about why he was engaging in rape. Um, there was another serial killer I interviewed, who his name escapes me at the moment. Um, he's actually incarcerated in Virginia. He raped and murdered 7 women when he was about 17 years old. I think it was within a 1 year time span. Excuse me, Monty Rissel is the guy.
Okay.
Monty is very interesting, a very interesting interview, very astute. Um, Freely admits what he did, very introspective about his crimes. So, some people are like that. They're very introspective. They know what they did, why they did it. They explain it to you. And then others just seem not to be really in touch with that component of themselves. When you expect that they probably would be, considering the length of time they've been incarcerated.
Right. Um, did you ever, after people were arrested or when you were doing interviews, was there anybody that ever like creeped you out or got under your skin to the point where you just like didn't want to be around them? I'm sure you've dealt with many different.
So,
But
yeah, not really in that sense. I mean, I'm 6'6", about 240 pounds. So I'm not a small person, right? So I'm not, and I was a cop before, so work patrol, and I arrested a lot of people, and I've arrested guys who threatened me, threatened my life, multiple times. So that I'm not, I'm never been intimidated by that kind of dynamic. I did interview. So there are two serial killers. I interviewed Henry Lucas. Uh, I interviewed him with Ray Biondi, now passed with he was lieutenant in charge of Sacramento County uh, Homicide Unit, and John Compton from Nevada Division of Investigations Homicide. The three of us interviewed Henry in Williamson County, Texas. Henry was an interesting interview. I was actually one thing that astounded me about Henry because he has almost, oh, well, he's deceased now, but he had almost no education. But his recall of, so he wasn't book smart, but he was very smart in terms of where he'd been. He could describe places that he'd been. So he was a predator, but all of his intelligence, I would say, was related to places he'd been, and I think this related to his ability to survive because he'd been on the street for so long that you have to develop this sense of where you are, what's safe, what's not safe. He was very had tremendous recall for places. But his partner, who I also interviewed in Florida, Luke Otis Toole, that was the only kind of creepy guy I ever, not because I felt threatened, I didn't, but Otis was just a very odd duck. I spent about 10 hours with Otis, and he was always just, he was making, uh, hard to explain it. I understood that he liked candy cane because I think we were interviewing him around Christmas time. Um, that he liked peppermint, so I brought for him this large peppermint stick, which he pretended to treat like a phallic symbol throughout the entire interview. Right, constantly like doing things, looking to see if we're watching, just to get under your skin. Right, it's just an odd guy, very odd. Probably the oddest interview that I've ever done for a serial offender. Not threatening, but just bizarre. Um, so I would say, yeah, he's probably the weirdest interview I've ever done.
so, what's the most fascinating thing you've learned from a serial offender throughout your career?
Well, I think the most important thing that I would take away is that serial offending is there's no template for serial offenders. That they're all different. They come from all races, all creeds, all colors, all parts of the world. And I learned this too in my spree killers. I wrote a book on spree killers. I have 419 spree killers in the book. Same thing, 47 different countries. Serial murder isn't unique to the United States. It's not unique to any country. Every country has serial killers. They all have different interests. They have different victim types. Or maybe they don't really have a victim type. Maybe, they're willing to attack males or females, young, old. Others have very specific victim types and won't work outside of that. Um, but they're all very different. And this is what I tell people when you are assessing a serial murder case, that you have to do the same analysis for that case as any other serial case. Even within the series, there are going to be differences, and you have to understand what those differences are and hopefully why you're seeing changes or differences in the cases. But there's no one template for serial killers. They're males, they're females, although females, they're typically a lot less female serial killers, and a lot less, the motives for serial killing for females is oftentimes different than for males. Um, but, they kill the old, they kill the young. Um, it's there's a serial killer out there who will target, you know, a various dynamic, various type of victim in a various type of location, um, that will be completely different than another serial killer. They're all different. They all have different motives. Some work in teams, most work alone. Um, but I think the variety is probably the biggest takeaway I would tell most people that you can't pigeonhole serial killers. And I would say that the vast majority of them are probably psychopaths. It is it is the hallmark of what allows them to repeatedly kill in sometimes very egregious, vicious, and brutal ways and act like they're completely normal a half an hour later. That lack of empathy, um, that narcissistic approach to life, the approach that um, everything really belongs to them. I think their motto is sort of like, what's mine is mine, what's yours is mine. That's the way they look at the world. Um, if I want to take it, I will take it. If it hurts you, that's okay with me. But I would say that psychopathy is probably very prevalent in almost all serial killers, some rather significant level of psychopathy. So those are probably the two big takeaways. And you start to see this when you interview these individuals and when you do research on these types of individuals and when you read the research that has been done by others. This is a big takeaway, and you have to be careful when you are looking at cases that you believe may be linked. And that's why I said one of the first things we do in serial cases is understand, do we actually have linked cases?
So, to round this out, I want to ask you about two different cases, and the first being the Zodiac killer. Have you ever gone down a rabbit hole with that case? And if so, do you have any theories on who might have done it, or do you know who done it?
No, I've read a lot on the Zodiac case. I never worked the Zodiac case, so I've never gone down that rabbit hole. Um, no, I haven't. Other than, just superficially reading the case. When I was a cop, two of the homicides, or one of the homicides, should have been a double homicide, happened at Lake Berryessa, which was very close to where I lived. Um, and in fact, um, just as an aside, when I was a police officer, um, I actually worked on the Golden State Killer case
Oh, wow.
because there were several homicides that happened in my jurisdiction, and I was working. We were pretty sure that this was a fairly athletic individual, and he was coming across fields, parking way out on county roads, and then coming across fields. Um, and so I remember a number of nights working all night long with night vision uh, equipment, surveying, from like 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., surveying these areas that we thought he would be coming through. But That was back when he was known as the East Area Rapist. He had various monikers over time, but that was one of my first actual introductions to working on a serial killer case that I, at the time was knew nothing about profiling, hadn't actually ever heard of it at the time. It was probably 1978, uh, 77 or 78. Um, the Zodiac case, other than just reading, I read the book on the Zodiac, uh, but I think it was Gray's book. I think that's the author, isn't it, Gray? Um, I have it over there. One of the, I've got hundreds of books on various offenders, but I did read the book on the Zodiac, but I never worked on the case and really don't have an opinion on it as to, you know, I know there's various individuals that have been proffered as being, the Zodiac, but I don't think it's ever been definitive as to who he is.
Right. I know there's like college kids that claim that they've cracked the code and this and that, but I know nothing's ever really been like actually out there as it being completely solved, which I don't think it ever
Right.
will be.
Yeah, probably not at this point. It's kind of like the Jennifer Lynn case, that the home, all of that area is completely changed, and that was it was a long time ago. Unless somebody on their deathbed admits to it and can provide, evidence to show that they have proprietary information, uh, probably won't be solved.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Another offender I want to ask you about is Richard Allen Davis. And the only reason I want to ask you about him is because I spent almost 3 hours with him a few weeks ago doing an interview with him. And he said after he was arrested for the kidnapping of Polly Klaas, somebody from the BAU had came, or either somebody or a few people had came and spoke to him. I was curious if you were one of those people that had spoke to him at the time.
No, that was my partner, Mary Ellen O'Toole. So I had a partner in the BAU. I originally came from the Sacramento division, and she came from the San Francisco division. We were both the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime coordinators in the FBI before we both promoted into the behavioral analysis unit. We knew each other for years before that. We worked each other's cases. Her case was the Jennifer Lynn case. I worked that case with her, um, and then took that case over when I got into the BAU. We both got into the BAU about the same time. And she was my partner for, almost 13 years. But she was the one that spent time with Davis, interviewed him, and and mostly because that had been her territory, the San Francisco Bay, San Francisco field office. So she was the one that worked that case. I did not.
So I've asked him before if he's committed any other homicides, and he told me that there were three marijuana farmers somewhere in I forget what it's Humboldt County, and he claimed
Yeah.
that there were three marijuana farmers that were tortured and murdered, and their hands and feet were nailed to the ground, and he claims responsibility for it. Have you guys ever suspected of him committing other murders?
I couldn't answer that. I don't really know. But why would he kill them that way? Did he explain?
He didn't. He just said that he robbed their marijuana. There was pounds and pounds of marijuana. Then he just killed them just for mere fun, really. But I don't know if I really believe him because all
Yeah,
these
it
years
doesn't
I've
really
known
it
him.
doesn't really make a lot of sense. And what you're describing is it takes a lot of effort, right? And how do you control them in this process? In other words, they're alive, and so you have to capture them. Now, how do you do that?
Right. Well, he
Because
told me he had a gun on them, and then he tied them all up, and then he nailed their hands and feet to the ground, and he basically tortured them to death. But I've known him for almost 10 years, and he
yeah,
told me this about 2 years ago, and I asked him why it took him so long to tell me, and he's like, "Well, I just didn't trust you. I don't trust anybody." And like, okay, I'm not sure if I believe that, but it's an interesting story nonetheless.
yeah, it doesn't. I guess you have to look at his history, but I mean, does it make sense? I always look at can someone control somebody like that? Individuals who are growing marijuana are probably very wary individuals. They're not unlikely to be taken by surprise. Why would he be up there by himself? Even if you have a gun, trying to capture three individuals at the same time, it's difficult. And what would be the point of, engaging in all that other behavior? He doesn't sound like a sexual sadist. That's what a sexual sadist would do. It's a fairly rare type of offender. Um, he doesn't strike me that way. There's nothing in his history that would suggest that. His writings, his drawings, nothing that I would see in his history that would suggest that. But that behavior he's describing would be a sexual sadist, right? Certainly a sadist. But yeah, it doesn't really make much sense. And of course, he can say that because, where was it? You don't know. And, you know, did they ever find these individuals? I mean, there's three people that are murdered and tortured, and he didn't bury the bodies or do anything else to them. Were they ever located? Seems like they should have been, right? Somebody would have missed them. So, yeah, those kind of stories sound good, but, until there's something that can provide some veracity to it, I think that's, you're right to like, and as you said, why didn't you tell me about these earlier, right? I've been talking to you for years, right? We have a level of rapport. And even that information you're telling me now, there's nothing I can really do with that. There isn't any specificity to it other than what you're telling me, but there's no specific location to go to. You don't know the names of who these people were. So, to throw that out there at this late date um, sounds gratuitous. And, what does it really get him other than, you know, you talking? Maybe he used that to keep you talking to him. I don't know.
Right,
But
right.
I'm wary of that because I've dealt with lots of offenders who claim doing lots of different things for various reasons. To sound good to others. Most of it is not true. And then we have people that claim to have done killings when they didn't do them at all,
Right, right. Yeah,
right?
like Lucas.
So yeah, unless you can vet that information, that type just remains, you know, I just hold it out here and go, okay, that's what you said. Can you
Right.
prove it? Do you have anything that can provide any veracity to what you're telling me?
Yeah, yeah. I think he just thought that I would be gullible, and like he did send me a piece of paper that he had like a I don't know if it's like a warrant or whatnot, but they took a blood test from him, and he claims it was for the marijuana farmers cold case homicides. But then I asked him, what were their names? Oh, I don't know. This was in like the 70s, and how old, like what color was their hair? How old do you think they were? I don't know. This was such long ago. I was strung out on drugs, this and that. I'm like, okay, so
Yeah,
probably.
yeah. Well, why would they be taking his blood in the 70s? Is that
Oh,
what
no,
he
no, no,
said?
no. This is recently. This was maybe like
Oh,
10 years ago. And
oh,
this is
okay.
like this is like he said that this was for like a cold case, a triple cold case homicide. And he sent me the paper, but it mentioned nowhere on the paper that this was for, a cold case triple homicide
Right.
or anything like that. It was just a routine blood draw. So I don't know if he was trying to string me along or whatever, but I mean, he's an interesting guy to say the least. I mean,
What was it? I mean, who was the agency? What agency was working this?
it was something in California. I forget what it was, but it was some type of like law enforcement agency, but I guess it could have been for anything, I don't know if they routinely take blood from prisoners to like run it in the system for cold cases or whatnot, but I'm
Well, his blood would have already been taken a long time ago and placed into CODIS.
hmm,
So I mean, there wouldn't be any reason to draw blood on him unless they're trying to identify whether he's currently using, illicit substances or, I mean, I can't think of any other reason why he would be drawing blood at this time. He's been incarcerated for, I don't
a
know.
long time. Yeah, like at least almost 40 years, I would say at least. I mean,
Yeah,
since I've been born, at least he's been locked up.
yeah. So what would be the point of drawing blood at this point? Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah, kind of weird, but he's always been one that's trying to get me to believe certain things. Like he's a prison gossiper too. He always tells me about the gossip in the prison, who's getting stabbed, who's having sex with the guards, all this, so on and so forth. I don't think he
Yeah,
really talks to
that may
anybody.
not even be true either, right?
Right, right. Yeah, he recently got moved from two different prisons because there was attempts on his life actually, because they're on the way to abolishing the death penalty in California, and everybody knows who the three strikes guy is. So I guess they ran into his cell at a previous prison, and they tried to beat him up and they knocked him out and were trying to stab him and all this. So I think it's a matter of time before Davis leaves this world because he is really sick too. And I guess every prison he goes to, he's on mainline now and he doesn't want to go to PC. So it's a matter of time before I think they take him out, honestly.
Yeah. Where is he? Where is he now?
Last I knew he was at Ironwood, I want to say, but he's waiting to get moved again because the last two prisons he's gone to, he's got beat up
Yeah.
each time he's gone to, and he refuses PC, which I don't really understand why he does. I mean, he knows that he's not going to make it, and he's in a wheelchair now too, at that. So,
Oh, maybe he doesn't want to be in isolation.
right, right, yeah,
Yeah.
maybe he just wants he just probably wants to go because he's told me that he's not afraid to die and he's
Yeah.
just ready to go. I mean, he knows he's never going to get out. I mean, he's
Well, it doesn't, honestly, in California, it doesn't really matter if they abolish the death penalty. I don't think they've executed anybody for an exceptionally long period of time. I think California has more inmates on death row than any other state by a long stretch. I think they've got maybe 1,000 people on death row.
yeah, 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 close to that, yeah, for sure. And
They've never executed. I don't know, when was the last execution in California?
I think it was
So,
Stanley Tukey Williams actually. I'm pretty sure he was the last execution, and I want to say that was in like the 80s. I want to say he was like
yeah,
a Crip leader, but besides that, I can't
yeah,
think of
well,
the
a
last time.
very long time. Yeah, man. Yeah, even if they didn't abolish it, there's no likelihood then that he would be subject to the death. I mean, that he would be killed,
Right, right.
executed.
So,
Anyway, yeah, interesting. Yeah, you have to take with a grain of salt what these individuals tell you. Honestly, unless somebody's willing to provide, um, you know, something concrete evidence that shows that they were involved or could provide some information that would be considered holdback information by the agency, the law enforcement agency investigating the case, something specific that only the killer would know. But throwing out stuff like, yeah, killed these three guys that were growing marijuana up in Humboldt County. Don't know who they were. Can't remember where it was. Yeah.
yeah,
Right. So, yeah. I mean, maybe it's true, but most likely it's not.
right, right. Yeah, probably just something to string me along, but he doesn't really need to string me along because I find his case really fascinating and he's an interesting guy.
No, but for entertainment's sake, for his
Right,
own
right,
entertainment, right?
right. Yeah, that's true.
Listening to you, basically trying to get information about it, right? Entertains him. So,
Right. Yeah, I've never thought about it that way. Yeah, that's completely true. So, Um, well, I appreciate you giving me your time today. I know we've been on here for almost an hour, so I appreciate, you give me your time. I've always wanted to speak to you about the BAU and different offenders. I've spoke to Dr. Catherine Ramsland now, Dr. Burgess, Dr. Michael Stone, may he rest in peace, Dr. Gary Picotto. So you're basically the
yeah.
last one that
Yeah,
I
I
wanted to
know
speak
I
to.
know all of them. I mean, Dr. Stone has passed, but of course, Catherine and I have written our book together, and we've written a number of articles together as well. Ann Burgess, I've lectured for Ann a number of times. Ann and I have published together. She's a great individual. Um, yeah, it's a small world, really, the people that do this kind of work. And you know them and you know the researchers that are doing, work in homicide and sexual homicide and multicides. I just was co-authoring an article that came out in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. I came out online in November. Yeah, I thought it was supposed to be in the January issue of the Forensic Sciences Journal, but it may be out this month on juvenile parricide, offenders who kill their juveniles who kill their parents and the various aspects of their crime scenes. So yeah, still fascinated by various dynamics within you know this is sort of a interesting aspect of youthful offenders who kill. So always interesting to stay in the research area, whether I'm actually you know doing analysis or reading. But yeah, it's a big change from the mid 70s when we first started doing this, right? It seems like a long time, but in the span of serial killings, our knowledge base is a pretty short time frame. So, but we've learned a tremendous amount, both behaviorally from offenders and forensically.
Right. Yeah, I can only imagine how far, especially with technology. I mean, there's
Yeah, and genetic genealogy has really helped solve a lot of interesting cases, long cases that have been around for a long time. So it's
right, like the
been,
Golden State Killer, like you were talking about, which is
yeah,
pretty wild.
yep, that's a good example of the case. The serial killer of the, I think he passed recently. Sometimes these names, I see the case and um, he was in Texas. Texas Rangers were
Oh,
dealing
Sam
with him.
Little, yeah, America's
Yeah,
Most
yeah,
Wanted.
Sam
Yeah.
Little. Yes, thank you for refreshing my recollection. Sam Little. Yeah. So another case, that would we have caught this guy without the advances in forensic technology? Hard to say. Um, I think that's also why it's much more difficult to be a long-term serial killer now. The days of Ted Bundy and a lot of those older type serial killers before the day of DNA and genetic genealogy and law enforcement practices, radio communications, um, 24/7 news, surveillance. All of these play a big role. I mean, look at the role surveillance played in the recent United Healthcare killing up
Hmm.
in New York. Surveillance photographs and surveillance video played a huge role, a critical role in getting this guy identified. And we forget about that. Even things as simple as databases. You know, before APHIS, before the other databases, the DEA's database, the Bullet database. For VICAP. These are all important um, in stopping offenders before they become prolific. So I think we'll stop somebody after maybe two or three murders that that 25 years ago, 30 years ago would have been a prolific serial killer. And I think that we intercept them much earlier now in their development.
Right. I've heard a few experts tell me that the old serial killers are basically nowadays mass murderers because it's probably so hard to get away with multiple murders nowadays. So they probably just go out and kill a bunch of people at one time to satisfy their needs or whatever.
Well, I think mass murders are different. I mean, spree killers and are different than mass murderers, or different than serial killers. There's some crossover, but
Right.
but I think they're different. I think their motivations are different. Their outlook on, getting away or being not being identified are very different. Mass murderers and serial killers are very, very different that way. Um, Spree killers can go one way or the other, but um, yeah, I think it's a different type of killer. But
Right.
anyway, I've enjoyed the conversation today.
Likewise,
I hope your
likewise.
listeners will enjoy it as well.
Oh yeah, I'm sure they will. I appreciate your time again, and maybe in the future, if I can land a big name serial killer, we can do analysis or something like that. I mean, I have so
Sure.
many in my catalog right now, but I'm definitely after a couple right now.
Okay, sure. Sounds good, Andrew.
Awesome. Thank you so much. You take care, okay?
You bet. You do the same.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
That was my interview with Mark Saffric. If you would like to pick up some merch and support the show, head on over to unforbidden truth.org. Thank you for listening. See you on the next one.